For as long as there have been sellers and buyers, one side of that exchange has studied the other far more closely than most people ever notice. Long before economics was a science, before a single university existed to teach it, market traders were already learning which colors caught an eye faster, which words made a crowd move quicker, which small design in a stall or a scale nudged a hand toward a purchase it had not quite planned to make. That old, quiet study never stopped. It only moved indoors, onto shelves, into checkout lines, and eventually into a phone carried in every pocket. The tricks in this list are not accusations against any single store or app. They are a long, well-documented record of how the human mind actually decides to spend, gathered by psychologists, economists, and the sellers who read their work just as closely as anyone studying it academically ever did. Some of what follows is nearly a century old: a folding metal cart, a bakery's ovens placed by the door on purpose. Some of it is as recent as a red circle sitting quietly in the corner of an app icon. One of the tricks ahead has been measured to move a purchasing decision more reliably than almost any advertisement ever could, and it costs the seller nothing at all to use. This is the psychology of money, not the morality of it, simply how the mind spends, calmly explained, one quiet design at a time. Look at two price tags side by side. One reads $4, the other reads $3.99. The gap between them is a single cent, and yet the second price feels meaningfully lighter, almost a different category of cheap. The effect has a name, the left digit effect. Because people read numbers left to right, the first digit does most of the work in forming a judgment, and the mind treats $3.99 as a $3 item long before it finishes processing the rest. The habit runs so deep that shoppers comparing prices under time pressure will sometimes choose the higher actual total if its leading digit happens to be smaller. Odd pricing like this is old. 19th century American department stores were already ending prices in 9 long before anyone had a psychological theory to explain why it worked. And one popular account from that era holds that the practice began as a way to force cashiers to open the register and issue a receipt for every sale, since a whole dollar amount could be pocketed without ever touching the till. Whether or not that particular story is the true origin, the pattern of prices clustering just under a round number has proven remarkably durable, showing up on everything from a corner bakery's loaf to a subscription service's monthly fee. Modern behavioral economists have run this exact comparison under controlled conditions, and the result holds up. People do not simply misread the number, they genuinely perceive the value differently, even when told exactly what is happening. Knowing the trick does not fully disarm it. The 9 at the end was never about the cent, it was about which digit you would see first. In the mid-20th century, the psychologist B.E.F. Skinner ran a experiment with a lever and a food pellet. When the pellet appeared every single time the lever was pressed, the animal pressed it calmly, stopping once it was full. When the pellet appeared at random, unpredictable intervals, the same animal pressed the lever obsessively, far past any real hunger, unable to stop checking. Skinner called this a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, and it remains one of the most reliable ways ever discovered to produce compulsive, persistent behavior in an animal, humans included. A slot machine is built almost entirely on this principle. The payout is unpredictable, occasionally generous, mostly absent, and that uncertainty is what keeps a hand returning to the lever far longer than a guaranteed, regular payout ever would. A phone works the same way. Pull it from a pocket, and there might be a message, a like, a sale, or nothing at all, and the not knowing is precisely what makes checking so hard to resist. Several people who helped design early social and shopping apps have said openly, in later interviews, that they studied casino mechanics directly while building notification systems, borrowing the unpredictable reward on purpose rather than by accident. The comparison unsettles people the first time they hear it, because a phone does not look like a slot machine. It has no lever, no coin slot, no flashing lights. It only has the same hidden schedule underneath, doing the same old work on the same old nervous system. Nobody built the reward to be predictable, that was always the point. In 2010, a designer named Hari Brignell needed a word for something he kept noticing on the web and could not yet name. Interfaces built deliberately to trick a person into an action they had not meant to take. He called the category a dark pattern, and one of the specific patterns he catalogued got its own nickname, the Roach Motel, after the old insect trap. Easy to enter, nearly impossible to leave. A subscription built this way follows a simple asymmetric shape. Signing up takes one click, one form, one moment of enthusiasm. Cancelling takes a login, a hidden settings menu, a phone call during business hours, sometimes a retention offer standing between the customer and the exit like a toll booth. Each extra step is small enough to seem reasonable on its own, a security measure, a chance to reconsider, a courtesy call. Stacked together, they form a genuine barrier. The pattern works because friction is asymmetric in a way frictionless enthusiasm is not. A person signing up is motivated and moving fast. A person trying to cancel is often distracted, mildly annoyed, and easy to discourage with one more click than expected. Design researchers have measured this gap directly, counting the number of steps required to join a service against the number required to leave it, and the numbers rarely match. Brignall's naming did something simple but lasting. It gave a shape that used to feel like bad luck, a subscription meant to be cancelled months ago, an actual name, and a history. A shirt priced at $40 looks ordinary. The same shirt, tag reading $90 with a line through it and $40 beside it, looks like a discovery, even though the shirt itself has not changed in any way at all. This is anchoring, one of the most thoroughly studied effects in behavioral psychology. The first number a person sees becomes a mental reference point, a kind of gravity well that every subsequent judgment gets pulled toward, whether or not that first number had any real basis. In classic demonstrations, researchers have shown that even a number known to be random, a spin of a wheel, a made-up figure read aloud, measurably shifts how people estimate something entirely unrelated to it afterward. The mind does not check an anchor's credentials before leaning on it. A price tag exploits the same mechanism directly. A manufacturer's suggested price, a strike-through figure, an original price that may never have been charged to a single customer, all perform the identical function. They set the frame the real price will be judged inside. Once that $90 anchor exists, $40 does not need to be objectively fair. It only needs to look fair by comparison, and by then the comparison has already happened. Shoppers who understand exactly how anchoring works are not immune to it either, since knowing a number is a starting point rather than a fact does little to loosen its grip once it is sitting there on the tag. The anchor never has to be true to keep doing its work. Offer someone a basic plan and a premium plan, and roughly half will pick each one. Add a third option, priced close to the premium plan, but offering noticeably less, and something strange happens. Far more people now choose the premium plan than did before, even though nothing about it has changed. Economists call this the decoy effect, and it has been demonstrated in experiment after experiment, most famously with magazine subscriptions, where a print-only option, a digital-only option, and a print and digital option were tested together. Adding a print-only option priced almost the same as the combined bundle did not attract buyers to itself. Instead, it made the combined bundle look like an obvious bargain by comparison, and demand for it rose sharply. The decoy does not need to sell, it is not built to be chosen, it exists purely to reshape the comparison happening around it, an option whose only function is to make a specific neighboring choice look generous, a basic tier, a premium tier, and a middle tier priced just awkwardly enough to make the premium tier look like the sensible middle ground, is one of the most common shapes this takes in a modern subscription menu. What makes the decoy effect particularly durable is how invisible the manipulation feels from the inside. Nobody experiences themselves as reacting to a decoy. They experience themselves as noticing, quite reasonably, that one option is clearly the smart pick. 3 choices rarely mean 3 real choices. One of them was often only ever there to make another one shine. Why does the phrase "only 3 left," printed in small red letters beneath a product photo, change how badly a person suddenly wants that product? The item has not improved. The price has not dropped. All that changed is a claim about supply. The psychologist Orobia Cialdini identified scarcity as one of the most reliable levers on human decision-making in his long study of persuasion, alongside principles like reciprocity and social proof. For most of human history, genuine scarcity was an important and honest signal. A dwindling resource really did need to be acted on quickly, and the instinct to want more of a thing the moment it seemed to be running out kept people fed and equipped when supplies were real and finite. A modern product page can manufacture that same signal cheaply and at will. A stock counter reading "only 3 left" may reflect true inventory, or it may be a fixed display element shown to every visitor regardless of how many units actually remain in a warehouse. Investigations into specific retailers have documented counters that never change no matter how many units are sold, because the number was never connected to real stock in the first place. The instinct scarcity triggers does not check its own accuracy before acting. It evolved in a world where a claim of dwindling supply was expensive to fake and usually true. It has not caught up to a world where the claim costs nothing, and the supply behind it might not exist at all. The three remaining units may be real. The urgency they trigger works exactly the same either way. Small banner beneath a product reads 500 people bought this today. Nobody checks whether the number is accurate. Very few people even pause to wonder. The number does its work simply by existing. Social proof, the tendency to treat other people's choices as evidence for the right choice, was one of 6 influence principles the psychologist Robert Cialdini catalogued from decades of studying persuasion in the field, alongside principles like scarcity and reciprocity. Its roots run deep. In an uncertain situation, watching what a crowd does has long been a fast, usually reliable shortcut for figuring out what is safe, correct, or worth doing, long before anyone had the leisure to reason it out for themselves. Classic conformity studies from the mid-20th century showed just how strong this pull can be, with people sometimes giving an answer they could plainly see was wrong, simply because everyone around them had already given it. A modern storefront applies the same instinct with none of the social pressure of a room full of people, only a running tally, a star rating, a stream of recent reviews, or a badge announcing popularity. The strangeness is in the mismatch. The crowd instinct evolved to help judge physical danger and social belonging among people a person could actually see and know. It has been redirected, almost effortlessly, toward judging whether a product on a screen is worth buying, based on strangers whose existence cannot even really be confirmed. 500 people may well have bought it, the number persuades regardless of whether anyone checks. Daniel Kayat A. Munn and Wymos Tversky found something that reshaped economics. The pain of losing something is felt roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining the same amount. Losing $20 hurts more than finding $20 feels good, even though the arithmetic is identical. This asymmetry, loss aversion, sits at the center of prospect theory, the framework Kahneman and Tversky built from years of careful experiments asking people to choose between certain and uncertain outcomes of equal expected value. Time and again, the fear of losing outweighed the appeal of an equivalent gain, a pattern so consistent it eventually earned Kahneman a share of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. A loyalty program built around points applies this asymmetry with real precision. The points themselves rarely feel like much while they are simply accumulating, but the moment they carry an expiration date or a tier status threatens to drop from gold or bound to silver, the prospect of losing something already held becomes a far stronger motivator than earning something new ever was. A customer who might not have chased another purchase for the reward will often make one simply to protect a balance they already consider theirs. The trick sits in a small but important slippage. Those points were never truly the customer's property in the ordinary sense. They were a conditional promise, revocable by the company that issued them. But loss aversion does not distinguish between a true possession and a conditional one, reacting to the feeling of loss regardless of what was actually owned in the first place. The account will always insist the points were never really yours to lose. Pay a flat fee at the door of a buffet, and something curious happens to appetite. People do not eat what they want, they eat, often past real hunger and real enjoyment, in proportion to what they already paid. Economists call this the sunk cost fallacy, a cost already paid, which by definition cannot be recovered, no matter what happens next, continues to influence decisions that should, by any strict logic, be made only by weighing the choices still in front of a person. The money at the door is gone whether one plate is eaten or 5. And yet very few diners walk in, eat a modest amount, and leave satisfied without a private sense that they left value on the table. The same pattern shows up well beyond food. A subscription paid for months ago but barely used gets kept, and even opened occasionally out of a nagging sense that cancelling now would somehow waste the money already spent, when in fact that money was spent and gone regardless of what happens today. A half-finished project, a ticket to an event that turned out disappointing, a course abandoned but paid for in full, all pull on the identical instinct. What makes the sunk cost fallacy so persistent is how reasonable it feels from the inside. Nobody experiences it as irrational in the moment. It feels, instead, like responsibility, like not letting that good money go to waste. The buffet simply makes the pattern unusually visible, one uncomfortable plate at a time. The money was already spent at the door. Everything after that was never about getting it back. In a well-known experiment, researchers handed half a group of students a coffee mug and asked how much they would sell it for. The other half, who never received a mug, were asked how much they would pay for one. The sellers, the ones who now possessed the mug, demanded roughly twice what the buyers were willing to offer for the exact same object. Daniel K. Munn, Jack Neksch, and Richard Thaler ran versions of this experiment repeatedly, and the finding held up. Mere possession, even possession lasting only a few minutes in a classroom, inflates how much a thing is valued. Economists call it the endowment effect, and it breaks a basic assumption of classical economics that an object's worth to a person should not depend on which side of a transaction they happen to be standing on. A free trial applies this quietly and deliberately. Once a service has been used for 2 weeks, once a streaming queue has titles saved to it, or a shopping cart holds an item sitting and waiting, the prospect of giving it up starts to feel like a loss rather than simply declining to buy something new. The trial does not need to prove its value through argument. It only needs to install a feeling of ownership long enough for cancelling to start feeling like a subtraction. The mug in the original experiment was worth exactly what it was worth. Holding it briefly only changed how parting with it felt. A study of a car wash loyalty program once ran a small but telling test. One group of customers received a blank card requiring 8 stamps for a free wash. Another group received a card requiring 10 stamps, but 2 were already filled in at the start, leaving the same 8 purchases still to earn. Both cards demanded identical effort. The group that started with a head start finished far more often, and finished faster. The finding is known as the goal gradient effect, and combined with what researchers call endowed progress, it describes something specific. Motivation intensifies as an imagined finish line draws closer, and simply appearing closer to that line, even artificially, is enough to change behavior, independent of the real distance still remaining. A modern loyalty punch card, paper or digital, uses the identical mechanism. A card that starts empty asks a customer to imagine an entire journey ahead of them. A card that starts with a stamp or 2 already filled in reframes the exact same journey as one already partly underway, which reads, to the part of the mind tracking progress, as measurably less distance left to travel. Digital progress bars have made this head start even cheaper to give, since unlike a paper card, an app can quietly adjust exactly how much progress to grant a new user before a single purchase has actually happened. Nobody examines a loyalty card closely enough to notice the finish line never actually moved. They only notice, and respond to, how far away it currently looks. Long before any product existed to be sold, human societies ran on a quiet rule. Something given creates an obligation to give something back. Anthropologists have documented versions of this exchange principle across cultures far removed from one another, suggesting it runs deeper than any single tradition, closer to a basic feature of how people cooperate at all. The psychologist Robert Cialdini named reciprocity as one of his core principles of persuasion, and demonstrated just how little the initial gift needs to be worth for the obligation to kick in. In one of his often cited examples, a small, unsolicited gift, handed over before any request was made, measurably increased how often people later agreed to a much larger favor from the same person, a favor with no real connection to the original gift at all. A free sample at a market stall, a complimentary appetizer before a meal is ordered, an unlocked premium feature offered to a new app user before any payment is requested, all lean on the same old lever. Supermarket sampling counters rely on exactly this principle. Shoppers offered a taste, even one they never asked for, buy the sampled product more often than shoppers who walked past without stopping, a pattern retail researchers have documented repeatedly. The sample is rarely, on its own, expensive enough to explain the sale that follows it. Its real function is to open a small debt in the mind of the person who received it, a debt that a purchase later quietly settles. The felt obligation rarely matches the size of the gift that created it, and that mismatch is not an accident, it is the entire mechanism. In a study led by the researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Moat Shon, and Danari L.E., participants were asked to assemble a simple piece of storage furniture themselves, while a second group received the identical piece already built. Afterward, both groups were asked to name a price for their furniture. The group who had assembled it themselves valued it noticeably higher, sometimes nearly as highly as professionally made furniture, despite it being, by any objective measure, exactly the same product. The researchers named this the IKEA effect, after the flat-pack furniture retailer, whose entire model depends on customers doing the final assembly themselves. The underlying principle reaches well beyond furniture. Labor invested in creating or completing something inflates how much that thing is loved, almost regardless of the actual skill involved or the quality of the result. A build-your-own meal, a customizable subscription box, a piece of software where the user configures their own dashboard before ever paying for it, all borrow this same mechanism. The customer is not simply buying a product, they are being handed a small, guided act of authorship, and that authorship manufactures an attachment no amount of advertising could produce as cheaply. What makes the effect strange is how little real choice is usually involved. The options offered often narrow, the customization largely cosmetic, yet the feeling of having built something sticks, regardless of how constrained the process actually was. The furniture in the study did not become sturdier for having been assembled by its owner, it only became, in the owner's own mind, considerably harder to give up. Why does a shopping cart total, complete and ready to pay, suddenly grow at the very last screen once a service fee or a delivery charge appears that was never shown on the product page itself? Researchers studying online checkouts have repeatedly found that revealing mandatory fees only at the final step, after a shopper has already invested minutes filling in an address, a card number, and a delivery preference, measurably reduces how often that shopper abandons the purchase compared with showing the full price up front. Economists call the broader pattern drip pricing, a headline number that looks complete, followed by charges added one screen at a time until the real total finally appears. The psychology behind it borrows directly from the sunk cost pull covered earlier in this list. Once several minutes have already gone into a purchase, the additional fee at the end competes not against the original, lower price, but against the discomfort of having wasted that time and effort for nothing. Many shoppers pay the surprise fee simply to avoid starting the entire process over somewhere else. Regulators in a number of countries have taken specific aim at this practice in recent years, requiring some retailers to display total prices earlier in the process, though the pattern persists regardless, because the final screen, by the time a shopper reaches it, is rarely the moment anyone reconsiders. The true price was always the one at the end, the number at the top was only ever the invitation. A shopping cart sits at $42. Free shipping begins at $50. Rather than pay a small delivery fee, most shoppers add another item, often one they had no earlier intention of buying, simply to cross the line into free. The shipping fee itself is framed as a loss, an unwelcome subtraction from an otherwise clean total, and crossing a bright threshold to avoid that loss feels like winning something rather than spending more to get it. This is mental accounting at work, the well-documented habit of treating money differently depending on which private ledger it seems to belong to. In this private ledger, the added item is filed as free, since it was the thing that unlocked account to saving, even though actual money still left the shopper's account to pay for. Retailers have refined this threshold carefully, often setting it just above an average cart size rather than exactly at it, ensuring that most shoppers arrive close enough to be tempted into adding one more thing rather than simply paying the smaller fee outright. The added item's own price rarely gets weighed against its own merits at all. It only needs to be cheaper than the delivery fee it appears to cancel out. A shopper who set out to spend $42 leaves having spent considerably more, in service of avoiding a charge that was, in absolute terms, the smallest number on the entire receipt. The savings was real, and so was the spending it required. A family-size bag of a snack looks like the obvious bargain next to the small bag beside it on the shelf, and most shoppers never do the arithmetic that would actually confirm it. Researchers studying what they call unit bias have found that people judge the value of a package largely by its overall size, rather than by its price divided by its actual contents, in part because pack sizes differ enough between brands and formats that a true price per ounce comparison takes real, deliberate effort most shoppers are not doing while standing in an aisle. A bigger container gets read, almost automatically, as automatically better value, independent of what the smaller print beneath the shelf tag might actually say. Retailers and manufacturers have found, whether by careful study or simple trial and error, that varying pack sizes and shapes across otherwise similar products makes a direct ounce-for-ounce comparison quietly difficult even for a shopper who wants to make one. A family size or bulk label performs its own kind of anchoring, implying a saving the unit price on the shelf tag does not always support once it is actually checked. The unit price sits on almost every shelf tag in tiny print at the bottom, where almost nobody standing in the aisle actually looks. The The bargain was never hidden, only made easy to walk past. A fast food combo meal, a streaming bundle, a software suite sold as one package rather than several. Bundling merges multiple prices into a single figure, and something in that merger quietly disables the ordinary instinct to check whether each part is actually worth what it costs. Behavioral researchers describe this as a breakdown in the usual mental accounting a shopper performs almost automatically on separate purchases. When 3 items are priced individually, a shopper can compare each price against its own perceived value and notice if one is out of line. Once those same 3 items are merged into a single combined price, that separate accounting loses its foothold, and the bundle as a whole gets judged instead, usually far more favorably than any close look at its individual components would support. The practice has old roots. Department stores ran bundle sales well over a century ago, and the fast food combo meal, pairing a sandwich, a side, and a drink at a price lower than buying all 3 separately yet still profitable for the seller, popularized the same logic for an entirely different industry. Streaming and software bundles, several services merged under one monthly charge, apply the identical fog to subscriptions rather than groceries. Ask a bundle's buyer to price each piece separately afterward, and most cannot do it with any real confidence. The bundle was built, in part, so that question would never need to be answered. The subscription menu shows 3 tiers. The middle one carries a small badge, most popular. Nothing else on the page explains where that claim comes from, and very few readers ever ask. The label performs 2 pieces of psychological work at once. It borrows the force of social proof, implying that a crowd of other customers has already looked at all 3 options and settled on this one, and it borrows the force of anchoring, framing the labeled tier as the sensible center between a stripped-down option below it and an expensive option above it. Documented cases exist of companies applying a most popular badge to a tier chosen for its margin rather than its actual popularity, since the label is a design decision made by the seller, not always a figure pulled from real purchase data. The badge costs nothing to add and very little to defend if ever questioned, since popular is a vague enough word to survive most scrutiny, even when the underlying number would not. A shopper glancing at 3 tiers for only a few seconds rarely has the patience to ask for the data behind a 4-word label sitting quietly above a price. 3 tiers and a badge can move a decision that an entire page of features and prices on their own would have left genuinely open. The badge alone often finishes the sale before the comparison even begins. Watch a sale page long enough, and a small clock in the corner will tick down towards 0, and something in you will want to act before it reaches it, even if you cannot fully say why. A countdown timer borrows directly from the psychology of scarcity, except the resource running out is not stock, it is time itself, and time pressure recruits a faster, more anxious style of decision-making than a person would normally use for a purchase of any real size. Genuine deadlines, a train departing, crouching, once made that fast thinking useful and even life-preserving. A sale page borrows the same urgency for a decision that in truth could usually wait until tomorrow with no real consequence. What makes the timer particularly effective is how little verification most shoppers ever attempt. Investigations into specific retail sites have documented countdown timers that quietly reset the moment a new visitor arrives, showing each person their own private deadline rather than one shared real expiration for the sale itself. The clock is real in the sense that it does count down. It is not always real in the sense that anything actually happens when it reaches 0. A ticking number is a very old kind of pressure, applied through a very new kind of screen. Whether the deal ends or not, the urgency it produces arrives on schedule either way. Somewhere in the mid-2000s, a designer named Utzu Raskin built a small piece of code that removed the bottom of the page entirely, letting new content load automatically the moment a reader neared the end of what was already there. It spread quickly across social feeds and, before long, into shopping apps as well. The feature solved a real design problem. The old click to see the next page was a small but genuine pause, a moment where a reader could just as easily decide to stop. Removing that pause removed the prompt to ask whether continuing was actually still worth it. Psychologists studying attention describe this as removing a stopping cue, the small environmental signal, a page break, a chapter's end, a closing bell, that a mind uses to decide when enough is enough. Raskin has said in later interviews that he has come to regret how effectively the feature works, describing the attention it captures as disproportionate to any benefit it was originally designed to provide. Shopping feeds built on the same mechanic apply it to browsing rather than reading. And a scroll with no bottom applies gently, constantly, to spending the same way it applies to attention. The page used to end somewhere, and that ending was doing more work than anyone noticed until it was quietly removed. A single red circle sitting in the corner of an app icon is engineered to be almost impossible to leave unread. B.J. Fogg, a researcher at Stanford, developed a behavior model describing 3 things that must align for an action to happen. A person needs sufficient motivation, sufficient ability to act easily, and a trigger prompting the action at the right moment. A notification badge is a trigger in its purest form, and red is not a color chosen at random. Human vision is drawn to red faster and more reliably than to most other colors, a visual instinct with roots in noticing ripe fruit, blood, or danger, long before it ever noticed a phone screen. Shopping apps apply the identical badge to price drops, restocked items, or a cart quietly left behind, borrowing a visual alarm originally meant to flag something urgent, and applying it to something merely commercial. The badge does not explain what waits behind it. It only insists, wordlessly, that something does, and that checking requires almost no effort at all, one tap, one glance, one small dissolving of the tension the dot created in the first place. A circle the size of a fingertip can move a decision an entire advertisement might have failed to make on its own. Why does breaking a 40-day streak feel worse than never having started one at all? Gamified streak counters, the small flame icon, the running tally of consecutive days, borrow directly from loss aversion, the same asymmetry covered earlier in this list regarding loyalty points. Once a streak exists, it stops feeling like a record of past behavior and starts feeling like an asset currently held, something that can specifically be lost on any given day it is not maintained. Protecting an existing streak recruits far more motivation than building toward an equivalent, but not yet started one ever could, even when the actual reward for maintaining it is small or entirely symbolic. Researchers studying habit formation note that a streak's psychological weight often has little to do with the value of the underlying behavior, and everything to do with the unbroken count itself. Habit and fitness apps, along with certain shopping and rewards apps, have adopted the streak mechanic deliberately, sometimes borrowing language directly from gambling design, since a missed day functions much like a small private loss rather than simply a pause. Some apps even offer a one-time streak freeze, letting a user pay, with money or with a smaller in-app currency, to protect a threatened streak from breaking, monetizing the very anxiety the streak mechanic was built to produce. The days themselves were never really an asset. Only the fear of losing the count made them feel like one. In 1982, a researcher named Ronald Mill-Imun wheeled 2 different tempos of background music into a real supermarket and quietly measured what happened to the shoppers walking its aisles. On days with slow tempo music, shoppers moved through the store more slowly, and the store's daily sales figures were measurably higher than on days when faster tempo music played, even though nothing else about the store, its layout, its prices, its products, had changed at all. Milliman's study became one of the founding pieces of what retail researchers now call atmospherics, the deliberate design of a store's sound, scent, and layout to shape behavior a shopper is rarely aware of noticing at all. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly simple. A slower walking pace means more time spent in front of more shelves, and more time in front of more shelves means more opportunities for something to catch a shopper's eye that a faster pass would have missed entirely. No single song makes a case for any single product. The tempo only adjusts how long the aisle gets to make its own case, shelf by shelf, for as long as the shopper lingers in front of it. Almost no shopper leaving a store with slow music playing would ever describe the tempo as the reason they stayed as long as they did. The reason offered, if any is offered at all, is almost always about the products themselves. Walk into certain stores and the first thing that reaches a shopper is not a shelf or a price tag. It is the smell of something baking, often drifting from an oven placed near the entrance specifically because of what that smell does before a single item is even seen. Scent marketing has a long, practical history in bakeries and grocery stores, where the aroma of fresh bread has been deliberately released near entrances, sometimes from ovens baking far more than the store could ever sell, purely for the smell's effect on shoppers walking in. Researchers studying olfactory psychology point to a simple anatomical reason this works so directly. Smell reaches the brain's emotional and memory centers with fewer intermediate steps than sight does, triggering comfort, hunger, and nostalgia before conscious evaluation even has a chance to weigh in. Unlike a price tag or a sign, a scent is rarely registered as marketing at all. A shopper who feels unexpectedly hungry or oddly at ease walking through a store's doors will usually credit the feeling to themselves, to a skipped meal, to a good mood, long before considering that the air itself may have been arranged. The smell was never an accident of the bakery in back, it was very often the front door's actual design. Step onto a casino floor, and two ordinary features of any other building quietly disappear. There is no clock on the wall, and there is no window to the outside. The design choice is well documented and long-standing, part of a broader architectural approach to immersive interiors that removes the ordinary cues, letting a person track elapsed time, daylight fading, an afternoon turning to evening, a clock's hands moving toward an appointment. Removing those cues loosens one of the simplest mental breaks a person has for deciding when enough time has passed and it is time to stop. Carpet patterns, low ceilings over gaming areas that open into high cathedral-like ceilings over walkways, and a near-total absence of straight sightlines to any exit all serve variations on the identical goal, keeping a visitor immersed in a continuous present, with no easy external cue reminding them how long they have actually been inside. Similar design logic, dim daylight, deliberately winding paths, an environment built to make time pass without being noticed, shows up in other immersive retail and entertainment spaces, built on the same underlying insight. A room with no clock does not stop time from passing, it only stops anyone in it from noticing quite how much of it has gone. Milk, eggs, and bread, the three items on almost every quick grocery trip, sit at the very back of most supermarkets, as far from the entrance as the building allows. The layout is not an accident of construction. Placing the most commonly needed staples at the furthest possible point forces a shopper who came in for one thing to walk past nearly everything else the store has to offer, aisle after aisle, display after display, on both the trip in and the trip back out. Retail researchers have documented this deliberate routing extensively, along with the companion practice of placing end-of-aisle displays and mid-aisle detours directly along that forced path, precisely where a shopper's attention is already loose and undirected. The psychology at work is straightforward exposure. The more shelves a person passes, the more opportunities exist for something unplanned to catch their eye, and a longer, more circuitous route simply manufactures more of those opportunities without ever needing to ask the shopper to buy anything at all. Familiarity does little to defeat it. Even a shopper who knows precisely where the milk sits still has to walk the same long route to reach it every single time. The shopper set out for one specific item and remembers, afterward, mostly a sense of having wandered. The route, in fact, was drawn for them long before they ever walked in. Move a product from a bottom shelf to the shelf directly at eye level, changing nothing else about it, and its sales will measurably rise. Retail researchers have documented this shelf placement hierarchy for decades, and manufacturers have responded accordingly, in many well-known cases paying retailers directly for the right to occupy the eye-level position on a given shelf, sometimes called slotting, treating it as valuable real estate entirely separate from the product's own price or quality. The mechanism behind the effect is almost disappointingly simple. Eye level requires no extra effort to notice and none to reach, removing two small pieces of friction that a bottom shelf or a top shelf both impose without a shopper ever registering the effort as a reason for their choice. Products aimed at children are often placed lower still, at a child's eye level rather than an adult's, applying the identical principle to a second, shorter shopper walking the same aisle. Meanwhile, stores' own preferred brands or highest margin items routinely claim the most valuable band of shelf space, while a cheaper alternative sits crouched below or stretched out of easy reach above. Long before any price is compared or any label is read, a great deal of a purchase decision has already been made simply by which shelf a hand happened to land on first. A child's hand, reaching up from a shopping cart seat, lands exactly where a rack of brightly wrapped candy has been placed, at a height chosen for that hand rather than any adult's. The checkout aisle is a deliberately built final opportunity, stocked with items too small and too cheap to plan an entire shopping trip around, but easy enough to add in the last idle minute before paying. Placing candy, gum, and small toys at a child's reach turns a captive wait in line into a second point of persuasion, entirely separate from the main shopping list, aimed at a shopper who was never actually doing the choosing to begin with, only asking loudly enough for someone else to. Retail researchers studying impulse purchases have long identified the checkout line as uniquely effective for exactly this reason. There is no aisle to wander past, no comparison to make, only a short wait with nothing else to do and a small, brightly colored temptation directly at hand. A parent standing in that line faces a different calculation entirely than they would in any other aisle, weighing a small purchase against the social cost of saying no in a public queue. The rack was never placed at that height by accident, and neither was the weight in front of it. Both were built for the same short, predictable window of low resistance. Handing over a folded stack of paper bills produces a small, almost physical wince that swiping a card for the exact same amount rarely produces at all. Behavioral researchers, including Dražen Prelec and George L. H. Henstein, have described this reaction as the pain of paying, a genuine, measurable discomfort that accompanies the visible loss of money at the moment a purchase happens. Cash makes that moment unavoidable. Bills are counted out, handed audible, and gone, all in full view of the person spending them. A card removes nearly all of that visibility, replacing a physical exchange with a signature, a tap, or nothing more than a beep. Retailers and payment companies have understood this trade for decades. One reason cash was gradually pushed toward the margins of many transactions well before digital wallets ever existed. The pain itself is not simply squeamishness. Researchers studying spending behavior have found that people paying in cash consistently spend less and report their purchases more accurately afterward than people paying by card for comparable amounts, suggesting the discomfort was doing real, if uncomfortable, work. Removing it does not remove the actual cost of anything. It only removes the small, natural break that once came attached to feeling that cost directly. The wince was never the problem being solved. It was, in its own small way, the safeguard. A tap against a reader takes less than a second, and in that second, almost every sensory cue that once made a purchase feel like spending has quietly disappeared. Contactless and stored payment methods extend the pain of paying research covered just before this. If handing over cash produces the strongest discomfort and a card produces less, a single tap or a saved payment method on a phone produces less still, sometimes barely registering as a transaction at all. There is no signature, no handling of a physical card, often not even a glance at a total before the purchase completes. Payment researchers have observed that as each successive layer of friction is removed, cash to card, card to tap, tap to a saved default on a phone, average transaction sizes and purchase frequency have tended to rise, following the same logic Prelec and Loewenstein first identified with card spending over cash. Each layer of friction removed from a payment also removes a small natural pause where reconsideration could occur, however briefly. A shopper fumbling for exact change has, without meaning to, a moment to notice the total. A shopper tapping a phone against a reader while already walking toward the door does not. None of this changes what anything actually costs. It only changes how completely that cost can pass by, in the moment, without ever quite being felt. The retail industry has a word, breakage, for money that is given as a gift and never actually spent at all. A gift card sits in a strange psychological space between cash and obligation. It is not quite the recipient's own earned money, which makes it easier to put towards something slightly beyond what they actually wanted or needed. Using the card as license for a small indulgence a paycheck might not have stretched to cover. At the same time, a card is easy to misplace, easy to forget, and, once its balance dips below the price of anything on the shelf, easy to abandon outright with a small remaining balance nobody ever collects. Retailers have studied this pattern closely enough to have a term for it, precisely because the unspent portion is not a rounding error. Industry researchers tracking gift card programs describe breakage as a meaningful, structural part of how the format performs financially for the businesses that issue the cards, quite apart from whatever is eventually redeemed. A card represents a sale completed the moment it is purchased, whether or not the balance on it is ever fully spent by the person who receives it, and whether or not the person who bought it ever thinks about it again. Some of a gift card's value, by design and by habit both, was never actually meant to be spent, only given. An envelope of coupons sits in a kitchen drawer, and the money they promise to save rarely behaves, in the mind holding them, like money at all. The economist Richard Thaler built much of his career studying what he called mental accounting, the well-documented habit of treating identically valued money differently depending on which private category it seems to belong to. In a series of now classic demonstrations, Thaler found that people spend a small windfall, a tax refund, a bit of found cash, more freely and more indulgently than an equivalent amount earned through ordinary income, even though a dollar is, by any strict accounting, exactly a dollar regardless of where it came from. A coupon or cashback offer creates the identical private category. The amount saved rarely gets folded quietly back into a household budget as simply spending less. More often, it gets mentally filed as a small windfall, earmarked, half-consciously, for something slightly beyond the original plan, an extra item, a treat, a small upgrade that the coupon itself seems to have paid for. A coupon is less a discount on what was already being bought than a small, self-issued permission to spend somewhere else entirely. $96 paid all at once looks like a real expense. The same $96 split into 4 payments of 24 looks like something else entirely, smaller, lighter, barely worth pausing over. Installment framing draws on the identical numeric anchoring that shapes how a price ending in 9 gets read. The mind weighs the number actually shown far more heavily than the arithmetic required to reconstruct the true total behind it. A payment plan that breaks a purchase into several smaller pieces is not changing what is owed. It is changing which number gets seen first, and for many shoppers, which number gets remembered at all afterward. The practice is not new. Layaway plans and installment furniture purchases date back well over a century, letting a purchase happen in pieces long before any digital payment existed. What changed is the speed and ease of the modern version, often approved in seconds at the exact moment a shopper is deciding whether to buy, embedded directly into a checkout screen rather than negotiated separately at a counter or a bank. Point-of-sale installment options have grown rapidly across ordinary retail purchases in recent years, extending a framing once reserved mostly for large furniture and appliance purchases to considerably smaller everyday items. The debt owed is the same whether it arrives as one number or 4. Only the costume it wears at the checkout screen has changed. 2 neighboring European countries, similar in nearly every measurable way, show wildly different rates of organ donor registration, and the entire gap traces back to a single sentence on a form. The researchers Rick Johnson and Daniel Goldstein studied this exact comparison and found that countries where the default option on a form was to be a donor, requiring an active choice to opt out, had donor registration rates far higher than countries where the default was not to be a donor, requiring an active choice to opt in instead. The actual preferences of the people filling out the forms barely explain the enormous difference. The default option itself, the choice requiring no action at all, does almost all of the work. A free trial that quietly converts into a paid subscription unless a person actively cancels before a deadline applies the identical mechanism to a purchase decision. Remaining subscribed requires nothing. Leaving requires remembering a date, finding a cancellation option, and completing several deliberate steps, and the sheer effort of that action, however small, is often enough on its own to keep a subscription running well past the point anyone would have chosen it fresh. A great deal of what looks like a financial decision was never really decided by anyone at all. It was simply left where the form put it. Signing up for a certain streaming service took researchers a single click to test. Cancelling the same service in the same test took several screens, a retention offer, and, in one documented case, a phone call placed during limited business hours. This asymmetry, cheap and instant on the way in, deliberately slow and effortful on the way out, is a distinct design choice from the general dark pattern naming covered earlier in this list, specific enough that regulators have begun measuring it directly. Consumer protection agencies in the United States have documented and pursued cases against subscription services precisely over this gap, counting clicks and screens on each side of the transaction and comparing the totals as evidence in their own right. Gym memberships built a version of the same asymmetry long before streaming services existed, a signature at the counter to join, and, in some well-documented cases, a certified letter to a specific address required just to leave. The regulatory attention exists because the asymmetry is unusually easy to prove. Unlike a vague complaint about persuasive design, a click count is a simple, countable fact. 3 clicks to join, 11 clicks, a phone call, and a hold time to leave. Some jurisdictions have moved to require that cancelling take no more effort than signing up did in the first place, a rule easier to state plainly than to enforce evenly across every service it applies to. The fight over that gap is still underway, one countable click at a time. 2 people, searching the same flight on the same day from 2 different phones, have been documented seeing 2 different prices for the identical seat. Researchers and journalists investigating online pricing have found that browsing history, device type, location, and even how many times a page has been visited can all feed into a price shown to one specific viewer, rather than one fixed number shown to everyone. Retailers and travel sites can adjust prices this way, using the same demand signals that in an earlier era only ever set a single shelf price, meant to apply equally to every customer walking through the door. The underlying technique descends from far older practices of price discrimination, charging different prices to different customers for the same good, a practice retailers have always attempted in some form, but historically found difficult to enforce without direct, face-to-face negotiation. This quietly erodes an assumption most shoppers still carry without examining it, that a price is a shared comparable fact, the same number anyone else would see standing in the identical spot. Once a price can be calculated per viewer, that assumption stops holding, even though the interface rarely announces that anything has changed. The number on the screen has always looked like a fact. Increasingly, for some purchases it is closer to a private offer, addressed to no one else. Look at a pair of shoes once on an unrelated website, and for the next several days those same shoes seem to follow you across nearly every page you visit. Retargeted advertising works by tracking a viewed but unpurchased item and then displaying it again, deliberately, across unrelated sites the same person happens to browse afterward. Part of why it works traces to the mere exposure effect, a well-documented finding from social psychology showing that repeated exposure to something on its own, without any new information at all, measurably increases how favorably that thing gets judged. The original demonstrations used nonsense syllables and unfamiliar faces, shown repeatedly to strangers who grew to prefer them simply through familiarity, with no other reason offered at all. A retargeted shoe advertisement layers this effect onto a product already considered once. The first sighting created a flicker of interest, perhaps not enough to buy. Each subsequent sighting nudges that flicker toward comfort, then toward familiarity, then, for some fraction of viewers, toward finally clicking through and completing the purchase the first sighting never quite closed. Unlike a stranger's face shown for the first time, the shoe arrives with a small head start of prior consideration already built in. An advertisement that succeeds by refusing to be forgotten is, in its own way, simply exposure doing the only work it was ever shown to do. Long before any company issued a loyalty card, human societies built elaborate ladders of rank and honor, private titles, colored sashes, ceremonial seats that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with status. Guild hierarchies, military ranks, and court precedents all performed a comparable function centuries before the first loyalty card was ever printed. Sorting people into visible status, not by wealth alone but by continued, demonstrated commitment to the group. A modern loyalty program, structured in ascending tiers often labeled with materials like silver, gold, and platinum, borrows that same very old instinct and attaches it to spending. Each tier functions as both reward and incentive at once. A customer who reaches gold status has been rewarded for past spending, and is simultaneously given a new, specific thing to protect, since a tier can be lost through inactivity just as it was earned through activity. This applies loss aversion, the asymmetry covered earlier in this list regarding points, to identity itself rather than to money directly. Losing a hard-won rank can motivate continued spending more powerfully than the promise of a new perk ever could on its own. The perks attached to a given tier are often modest: a slightly earlier boarding time, a birthday discount, a dedicated phone line. The rank itself, the label, and the sorting it implies, frequently does more motivating work than the practical benefits attached to it. There is a strange comfort in being sorted into a rank by the very company that invented the ranks to begin with. A restaurant menu lists its dishes as simple numbers, 28, 34, 42, with no $sign standing beside any of them. Menu design researchers have found that removing a currency symbol from a printed price measurably softens things how consciously a diner registers the act of spending money at all, since a bare number reads more like a quantity, a count, than like a cost being weighed against anything else. The missing symbol does not hide the number. It simply removes the small visual cue that would otherwise flag the number as money leaving an account. Placement does further related work alongside the missing $sign. An expensive dish listed first on a menu or set apart in its own box functions as an anchor for every other price a diner reads afterward, making everything beneath it look, by comparison, considerably more reasonable than it might have on its own. Some menus deliberately omit prices from a dessert or wine section entirely, letting a diner choose freely without a number nearby at all, until a bill quietly totals the choice later. A menu is a carefully drawn document long before a single dish is actually chosen from it. Ask a sommelier which bottle on the list sells best to a table that has never visited the restaurant before, and the answer is rarely the cheapest one available. Restaurant consultants have long observed a pattern often called the second cheapest bottle phenomenon. Diners disproportionately avoid the very bottom price point on a wine list, not because they have judged the wine itself to be worse, but because ordering the cheapest option in front of guests or a partner carries a small social cost, fear of looking unwilling to spend. The second cheapest bottle offers an escape from that discomfort while still feeling, to the diner choosing it, like a frugal decision. Some restaurants have been documented pricing a specific bottle to sit deliberately in that second position, at the highest margin the format allows, precisely to capture diners reaching for exactly this compromise. The choice functions as a close cousin of the decoy effect covered earlier in this list, except the comparison being manipulated is social self-presentation rather than pure value between two products. The bottle chosen feels personal, a small act of individual taste and judgment, when in fact its position on the page was arranged well in advance of anyone sitting down at the table. Scan an item at a self-checkout kiosk, and the only witness to the entire transaction is a small screen and a set of sensors, with no cashier's eyes anywhere nearby. Researchers studying self-checkout behavior have found that removing a cashier's watching presence changes shopping behavior in measurable ways, extending well beyond the widely discussed question of theft. A human cashier functions as a small, constant social mirror, someone whose presence shapes behavior simply by existing nearby, independent of anything they actually say or do. Remove that mirror, and a shopper's attention to their own scanning, bagging, and final total loosens in ways that are easy to overlook and hard to fully measure. The reduced friction cuts in more than one direction. Some shoppers report scanning more carefully at a kiosk, wary of an error flagging an attendant over. Others, studies suggest, become measurably less careful and less deliberate about what actually makes it into the bag, an unplanned item slipping through with less of the scrutiny, self-imposed or otherwise, that a queue and a cashier once quietly provided. Retailers have weighed this trade carefully, since the labor savings of removing cashiers must be balanced against exactly this loosened attention, a cost that rarely appears on any receipt but shows up clearly enough in store-level data. A great deal of ordinary carefulness at checkout, it turns out, was being propped up by another person simply standing there and watching. In 1937, an Oklahoma City grocer named Sylvan Goldman unveiled a folding metal frame meant to solve a simple problem. Shoppers carrying a hand basket stopped shopping once the basket got heavy. Goldman's invention did not succeed immediately. Early customers found the folding frame strange. Some men reportedly saw it as effeminate to push, and older shoppers associated it with the baby carriages of a much younger family stage of life. Goldman resorted to hiring models to push the carts through his stores, demonstrating there was nothing embarrassing about it, until the habit finally caught on and spread to grocery stores across the country and eventually the world. What is less well known than the invention itself is its documented pattern of growth. Cart capacity has expanded steadily across the decades since, and retail researchers studying the trend have found a straightforward psychological reason behind it. A half-empty large cart nudges a shopper to keep adding items to fill the visible gap, in a way a half-full small cart, already looking reasonably full, never quite does. A shopper's own sense of having bought enough is calibrated, in part, by how full the container in front of them appears to be. An invention built purely for convenience became, slowly and by nobody's single decision, an instrument for encouraging exactly what it was built to carry. A card that promises money back on every purchase sounds, on its face, like a way to spend less. Its actual design does something closer to the opposite. Cashback and points-based rewards are structured so that the prospect of getting a small percentage back functions, psychologically, as an incentive to spend more in the first place rather than an incentive to save. The return is framed as a pure gain, worth actively chasing, which quietly reframes the spending required to earn it as costless, sometimes even as profitable, in the moment a purchase is being considered. This is the identical mental accounting sleight covered earlier in this list regarding coupons, applied here from the other direction. Instead of licensing a purchase already made, it encourages a larger purchase to be made in the first place. Card issuers have refined these programs over decades, often raising cashback rates specifically on categories, groceries, dining, travel, where everyday spending is already highest and easiest to increase further. The arithmetic behind a cashback offer rarely survives close inspection. A return of a few percent on a purchase still requires spending the entire remaining amount to receive it, and no cashback rate, however generous it appears on a card's advertising, returns more than a fraction of what it was designed to encourage going out the door. A discount that only exists once, money has already left the account, was never really built to help anyone keep more of it. A red sticker on a price tag primes a shopper to expect a bargain before a single number on it has actually been read. Retail signage has long favored red for sale and clearance displays, a preference with two separate routes working together. The first is purely visual. Red offers high contrast against most store environments, wood tones, neutral shelving, white price tags, making it one of the fastest colors for the eye to locate in a crowded field of competing information. The second is cultural. Decades of consistent use have conditioned red, in retail settings specifically, to mean discount and urgency, an association strong enough now that the color alone can prime an expectation of savings independent of anything printed beside it. A red tag on an item priced at its ordinary, full amount can still produce a flicker of bargain hunting excitement in a shopper glancing past it quickly, since the priming happens before the actual price registers at all. Retailers studying signage effectiveness have found that a red tag or red lettering measurably increases how often shoppers stop to look at a display, compared with identical signage in a neutral color, regardless of the actual discount being offered underneath it. A color can do a portion of a sales persuasive work all on its own, well before any real number ever gets read. Before it meant discounts, the phrase Black Friday meant something closer to disaster, coined by police officers in Philadelphia in the 1950s and 60s to describe the gridlocked traffic and unmanageable crowds that arrived every year on the day after Thanksgiving. Retailers disliked the association and spent years trying to displace it with a friendlier name before eventually giving up and reframing it entirely. A second, more flattering origin story took hold instead. The idea that the day marked the point in the year when a store's accounts moved from being in the red to being in the black, from loss into profit, thanks to the volume of holiday shopping suddenly arriving all at once. The retail meaning eventually won out so completely in public memory that the original exasperated police usage is now largely forgotten outside of local history. A modern doorbuster sale operating on that same morning stacks nearly every trick already named across this entire list, one on top of another, at a scale ordinary shopping rarely reaches. A countdown to opening functions as scarcity made physical. A crowd already lined up before dawn supplies social proofs simply by being visible to itself. Limited stock, real or advertised, recruits urgency. A queue that formed hours before sunrise recruits a kind of sunk cost before a single purchase has even been made, since standing in the cold that long has to be worth something. Every quiet trick in this list has at some point played out in miniature, on some ordinary Tuesday, in some ordinary aisle, on one cold morning each year, in one long line stretching into the dark. They have simply all played out together at once. The line outside on that cold morning eventually goes inside, the doors open, and the crowd disperses into 100 ordinary decisions no one will remember making by name. A cart gets filled a little fuller than planned. A subscription renews itself quietly in the background. A red dot gets tapped and the tension it created simply dissolves. None of this makes anyone foolish for having felt any of it. The tricks catalogued across this list were built, tested, and refined by people who understood the mind, at least as well as the psychologists studying the very same effects, sometimes better, and refined further with every purchase that followed. Feeling an anchor's pull or a streak's quiet threat or the warmth of a free sample is simply what it feels like to have a mind built the way minds are built. It has never been a personal failing to notice afterward that a decision was nudged. Some of the effects named here will feel obvious in hindsight, the kind of thing that seems clear only once it has a name attached to it. Others will likely go back to being invisible again within a day or two, doing their quiet work exactly as well as they did, before anyone paused to notice them out loud. What changes, if anything changes at all, is smaller and quieter than a lesson. It is only the noticing itself, a countdown clock seen for what it is, a crossed-out price recognized as a number invented for the tag, a stamp card's head start understood as exactly that, a head start, not a fact about how close the reward really is. The sellers studying the buyers were never wrong to study so closely. It is, after all, an old trade, older than any single store or app, and it will likely outlast every trick named in this list, replaced eventually by others not yet invented. The cart rolls on toward the register regardless, it always has.